What is up, and welcome back to Beyond the Arc with Brandon Silvers. As always, I am your host, Brandon Silvers, talking about NBA offseason moves with the benefit of hindsight. But first, if you are in the Low Country area, I am once again emceeing another edition of The Light Show presented by Mr. Enlightenment and friends. If you want to hear some dope poets, come through July 18th from 6 to 8 p.m. at Firefly Distillery. Tickets are $10 in advance. Link is in the show notes. I had a blast emceeing the first one back in May. A lot of talent was on display. I will also link my interview with Mr. Enlightenment in the show notes as well. Going to be a lot of fun, so come through. All right, the NBA's collective bargaining agreement has caused a ton of movement this offseason, and naturally, everyone is jumping out to give their opinions on what these moves mean for the upcoming season and beyond. But you know, we like to do things differently here. While it's fun to try to predict what's going to happen, it's impossible to know since we can't look into the future. It's pure speculation, and I like to save that for my season previews. What we can do is look back and talk about the moves that led to these moves and evaluate those. So let's do that today and take a look at one of these splashier moves this offseason, which is Paul George leaving the Clippers and signing with the Philadelphia 76ers. Ever since the Clippers moved to LA, they've played the role of little brother to the Lakers. This is a franchise that was so inept, such a joke, that I remember Jay Leno roasting them on The Tonight Show when I was little. How many teams have crossed over into the mainstream just by being terrible? Even as their best and most exciting era coincided with the decline of the Lakers, the Lob City Clippers were more of a novelty than a threat to actually win anything. They made the playoffs, they had highlights, but that was that. It was still a Lakers town. However, they do have one significant competitive advantage over the Lakers in that Steve Ballmer, who bought the team when Donald Sterling was forced to sell after years of being racist, among other things, has more money than the Buss family. In fact, he has more money than every NBA owner. In February of this year, the Big League released a list of NBA owners with the highest net worth, and Ballmer topped it with $142 billion. Number 2 on the list was Cavs owner Dan Gilbert with a net worth of $25 billion. That is one hell of a gap. Ballmer's super passionate about the team. He has plenty of money to spare to try to do the impossible and turn them into winners. And in 2019, that's what he aimed to do. That free agency class was stacked. Kevin Durant, Kyrie Irving, Jimmy Butler, and Los Angeles native Kawhi Leonard. Kawhi had just done the impossible himself by leading the Raptors to the NBA title as they upset the Warriors after Kevin Durant tore his Achilles in Game 5 and Klay Thompson tore his ACL in Game 6. Nobody really knew what Kawhi wanted to do because he's Kawhi, but the general vibe was that he wanted to head back to the West Coast. The assumption, of course, was the Lakers, but Ballmer and the Clippers had a chance to one-up them and sign a guy who had just shown he could carry a franchise to a title damn near single-handedly. And even without Kawhi, the Clippers were the better team at the time. The Lakers had LeBron, but he'd had an injury-riddled first season in LA as they won just 37 games, while the Clippers won 48, and they had some nice pieces to build around too. Now, I have no reason to believe, and I didn't really at the time either, that the Lakers were ever a real option, but I do think re-signing with the Raptors was. However, looking at the landscape of the league, Kawhi wanted to play alongside another star, another LA native, Paul George. Paul had already lived a full NBA lifetime by this point, despite being just 28 years old. He'd gone from a prospect with a ton of potential to the best player on a Pacers team that was the second best in the East behind the Heatles. Then he suffered what looked like a career-altering, if not ending, injury playing in a scrimmage for Team USA. Incredibly, he came back from that, but we all seemed to accept that he'd never be a number 1 guy on a championship team. His ceiling was that of a great number 2 option due to the injury and also some underwhelming playoff performances. He ended up in Oklahoma City where he was fulfilling this prophecy until all of a sudden he had a career year in 2018-2019 that saw him finish 3rd in MVP voting. Maybe he'd end up a superstar after all. This seems kind of crazy now, but post-leg injury, he was pretty healthy. He played in at least 75 games for 4 years in a row, and his numbers peaked at a ridiculous 28 points per game, 8 rebounds, 4 assists, and 2.2 steals. The thinking was that he finally figured out how to play in a body that was slightly different than the pre-injury version and was headed into his prime. When it came to two-way wings at the time, he was considered number 2 in the league behind Kawhi. LeBron looked to be finally breaking down, which is hilarious in hindsight, and nobody knew what Klay would look like post-ACL tear, so it was Kawhi and Paul. And the similarities didn't end there. Both were from LA, like I said. Both played college ball in the Mountain West Conference. Kawhi at San Diego State and Paul at Fresno State. Both 6'7", 6'8", developed their offensive games a lot after coming into the league. And they were actually both drafted by the Pacers in back-to-back drafts, but Kawhi was traded to the Spurs for George Hill on draft night. No doubt because the Pacers knew his skill set would be redundant with Paul George already there. Both on and off the court, you see why Kawhi would want to play with him, and he made that clear to the Clippers, but George wasn't a free agent, so they'd have to trade for him, which again means trading for the second best two-way wing in the league coming off a career year. But when you're trying to make a big splash, trying to overtake your big brother in the same city, and you have the chance to put together the best wing combination since Jordan and Pippen, you do it. And by all accounts, Kawhi wasn't coming if they didn't get Paul, so the Clippers pulled the trigger and sent Danilo Gallinari, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, and 5 first-round picks to OKC for Paul George. So now that era's come to an end, how did it work out? The Clippers obviously have not won a championship, but that doesn't necessarily make a move a failure. And even if they did, quote unquote, lose the trade, how badly did they lose it? First, to properly evaluate this trade, we cannot look at it as Paul George for all these picks and Danilo and SGA, but as Paul George and Kawhi for Danilo, SGA, and all these picks, since again, the Clippers wouldn't have gotten Kawhi without Paul George. With that as our starting point, let's move on to evaluating the players portion of the trade first, then we'll get to the draft picks. So where does Danilo Gallinari and Shai Gilgeous-Alexander for George and Kawhi get us? Danilo Gallinari played 1 season for OKC and put up nearly 19 points per game. However, this is a guy who has only played in 70 games twice in his career, and he's done that 0 times since 2012-2013. The Thunder sent him to Atlanta in a sign-in trade for a second-round pick after his one and only season there, which gives you an idea how the league valued his lack of durability versus his scoring ability. He played a couple of seasons for the Hawks where he flashed that scoring ability and also flashed his lack of durability before missing all of the 2022-2023 season due to a torn ACL. He's a guy who makes Kawhi and Paul George look like AC Green. When he has been healthy enough to play, it's clear his skills have deteriorated. He played for 3 teams last year and is barely hanging on to a spot in the league. That single halfway healthy season in OKC doesn't add up to much in the grand scheme of things. Obviously, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander is another story. He just finished up his rookie season when the trade took place, and he looked promising, putting up 11, 3, and 3 during the regular season. He nearly doubled his output his first year in OKC and continued improving while navigating his own injury issues the next 2 seasons. Now, these last 2 years, he's taken off. Back-to-back All-NBA first-team selections, including finishing second in this year's MVP voting as he led the Thunder to the number 1 seed in the West. If we were judging this trade based on Paul George alone, the Clippers would have lost here already. SGA is slightly smaller and not quite the three-point shooter George is, but he's 7 years younger and has been more durable even with his injuries. He scores more, he defends at nearly the same level, and he's a better playmaker. Moving forward, if I'm the Clippers, I would want Shai over both Kawhi and Paul George, but that's me projecting out, and we're doing hindsight right now. And even with all of the injury problems, I can't quite get to a point where I value Shai over 2 players of their caliber. But using hindsight, that trade is already kind of close, and you would think that the draft picks would make it a blowout in favor of the Thunder, but that's actually not quite the case when you dig into it. The 2021 first-round pick wasn't even LA's to begin with. It was a Miami Heat pick that they moved way back in 2015, along with the guy George basically replaced in Indiana, Danny Granger, in a 3-team trade that brought the Dragic brothers to Miami. It bounced around some more before the 76ers sent it to LA to get the guy George is basically replacing now, Tobias Harris. OKC got it and selected Tre Mann, who has looked the part of a solid backup point guard so far. However, he's no longer on the Thunder because they sent him to Charlotte in a package for Gordon Hayward, who stinks. He averaged 0 points per game in 6 playoff games this postseason. Gallinari, a couple of seasons of Tre Mann, and half a season of Hayward isn't enough to help SGA overtake Kawhi and George. The 2023 first-round pick also originated with the Heat, but came over to the Clippers just 4 days before the Paul George trade in the 4-team trade that sent Jimmy Butler to Miami. OKC sent it back to Miami before even using it in 2022 when they traded for KZ Okpala, who they waived days later. So again, not a huge get for the Thunder, clearly a cap space move, which is fine, but not enough to send this trade over the top for them. The Heat used this pick to select Jaime Jaquez, who I want to believe is a good NBA player, but I have to see him outside of Miami to be sure. As someone who's had to live through Kendrick Nunn and Gabe Vincent's post-Heat careers, I know those players can be fool's gold. Now, these draft picks do end up tipping the scales in favor of the Thunder, and the player that did it was the 2022 first-round pick the Clippers sent. It was their own pick, and OKC used it to select Jalen Williams 12th overall. It was tough to evaluate this one without projecting his future, and he's only played 2 seasons, but Williams has been, at worst, the second best player from his draft class. He actually leads that class in win shares and would be 7th in win shares in the 2021 class, despite them playing 1 more season than him. Talent-wise, neither Paul George nor Kawhi have played at the level they were at that made the Clippers go all in on this move. Of this group, SGA has quite clearly been the best player for the past 2 seasons, and we can argue the same for 2021-2022 when Kawhi missed that entire year with an ACL tear. The stats are basically a toss-up between SGA and George that year, except SGA played in 25 more games, and that's where this Clippers pairing has failed the most. If we look at both pairings, Kawhi and Paul have played in only 42 more games than SGA and Jalen, despite Jalen being in the league for 3 fewer seasons. Paul and Kawhi have missed so much time that the team felt the need to trade for a 3rd star in James Harden to help carry the load when one of them was inevitably sidelined. Despite this, and despite Kawhi and Paul playing in their most games as a Clipper this season, they still won 6 fewer games than OKC. So you throw in some Tre Mann here, a dash of Danilo Gallinari there, and OKC won this trade in hindsight, but just barely. That's the good news for the Clippers. They swung for the fences, they used some assets that weren't theirs. OKC missed on some draft picks, and LA did make a conference final in that weird 2021 season that I always forget about. The bad news is that if the team that acquired the most assets and the younger assets just barely wins the trade in hindsight, then it's set up to be an absolute blowout moving forward. Half of what the Clippers got, Paul George, is gone, and they got nothing in return for him. The other half, Kawhi, is an injury-plagued 33-year-old. On the other hand, for OKC, SGA and Jalen still have not hit their prime as NBA players. Even if the other picks from that trade don't work out, Williams and SGA could keep running up the score for the OKC side of things for the next 5 to 10 years. There are still a couple of picks in next year's draft in 2026 left, as well as OKC's pick this year, Dylan Jones from Columbia, South Carolina and Weber State. Shout out to Harold Arsenault. And while it's easier to understand that move if we go back in time, it's not like there weren't red flags. Kawhi missed all but 9 games his last year in San Antonio due to a degenerative quad condition. Everyone knew he was going to be a load management guy moving forward. Toronto did it well enough to get a title out of it, but looking back, I'm not sure why you would choose to build around a guy who you knew was only going to get worse health-wise if you're the Clippers. It's a similar story with Paul George. He seemed to have put his health concerns behind him, which obviously ended up being a different story, but there was no real reason other than optimism to believe that near MVP season was anything other than a fluke. He had developed himself into one of the smoothest offensive players in the league, but all that would fly out the window at the worst times possible, specifically in the playoffs. This was the case pre-injury, post-injury in Indiana and in OKC. At his best, He was a number 2 option, a great number 2 option, but one that needed to be beside someone else to succeed. Contrary to popular belief, this is not an insult, but you shouldn't pair him with a guy who you could almost guarantee would miss time, and that's exactly what the Clippers did. Which is why this move confuses me for the 76ers. It feels like they're repeating the same exact mistake the Clippers did, except their star, Joel Embiid, is way more Paul George than Kawhi in the playoffs, and George himself is even further removed from his prime. If I had to guess, their thinking is that George is really the number 3 guy, as Tyrese Maxey really took a leap last season, and he's a fantastic number 3 option and an upgrade over Tobias Harris, who they had to move on from. But I'm not seeing the vision. He's got a higher ceiling than Tobias for sure, but to give him a max deal when he also has some of the same issues that Tobias had in terms of disappearing during big games, he's got the injury issues, he's getting older, he's 7 years older than Tobias was when they overpaid for him. I just don't get it. I will say Paul George does have the best NBA player podcast out right now, so maybe he'll end up coaching the Lakers when this is all said and done. Let's circle back to it when his contract expires in 2028. All right, this has been another episode of Beyond the Arc with Brandon Silvers. Appreciate you watching, listening, rating, subscribing, reviewing, and sharing. Do not forget to check the link in the show notes for tickets to the light show. I've got some more fun stuff coming up next week as well. Until then, stay safe and I will catch you later.